Hi, everybody. I'm Rayanne Parker. I'm so happy to be here today to welcome you to the Southern Festival of Books, Women's National Book Association Nashville panel. We are part of WNBA National. This is an organization that exists to promote reading and support the role of women in the community of the book. And we're so happy to be here with our annual Coffee with Authors event. Our moderator today is Patti Callahan Henry. Patti is the New York Times and USA Today best-selling novelist of 15 novels, including Becoming Mrs. Lewis and Saving Savannah, out now, and the upcoming Once Upon a Wardrobe, which I love.
I know.
She is also the recipient of the Harper Lee Distinguished Writer of the Year, the Christie Book of the Year, and the Alabama Library Association Book of the Year. Patti is the co-founder and co-host of the popular web series and podcast, Friends in Fiction. Patti, I'm so glad to see you, and it's my pleasure to turn it over to you.
Rayanne, thank you. I wish we were together in real life on a stage so I could give you a big hug. Thank you for all the kind words about Once Upon a Wardrobe.
This is our second best thing to be here virtually.
I know. It's as good as it gets right now. So.
Absolutely. I'm turning it over to you.
Thanks, Rayanne. Hi, everyone. I am Patti Callahan, and I am so happy to be talking to these three powerful female authors about their newest and upcoming books. First, I want you to meet Jennifer Saint. Due to a lifelong fascination with ancient Greek mythology, Jennifer Saint read classical studies at King's College. Jennifer, I'm really jealous of that. I mean, just even visiting King's College inspires me. I can't imagine going to school there. She spent the next 13 years as an English teacher, sharing a love of literature and creative writing with her students. Ariadne, and I'm going to ask her if I'm saying that right, I'm not positive I am, is her first novel. I can't believe this is your debut novel. It is astounding. And she is working on another retelling of an ancient myth revolving around, you're going to have to say that name, Clytemnestra and her daughter Electra. Jennifer, did I say it right?
Yeah, thanks so much. And I think, when it's ancient Greek names, it's a dead language. You can get away with the pronunciation.
Okay, say Ariadne. Say it.
I think I would say Ariadne.
Ariadne. Okay, I'm doing it semi-right. Well, I'm excited. And I know it was picked as a book of the month for the Book of the Month Club. And I'm excited about talking about it. Next, I want y'all to meet Kelly Mustian, the author of The Girls in the Stilt House. Hi, Kelly.
Hi.
Kelly grew up in Natchez, Mississippi, the southern terminus of the historic Natchez Trace. Her work has appeared in numerous literary journals that we do not have time to list, and commercial magazines. And she's a past recipient of the Blumenthal Writers Award and a regional artist grant from the North Carolina Arts and Science Council. She currently lives near the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina, and The Girls in the Stilt House, just like Jennifer, is a debut novel. I'm so happy to see you.
It's good to be here.
Next, I want y'all to meet Leah Weiss. I said that right. I do believe.
Yes, you got it correct.
Thank you. I practiced. Leah Weiss is a Southern writer from North Carolina, born and raised in the foothills of Virginia. No, born in North Carolina and raised in the foothills of Virginia. Her debut novel, If the Creek Don't Rise, which is such a great title, was released in August of 2017. Her short stories have been published in Simple Life, Everyday Fiction, and Deep South. Welcome, y'all. We are so happy to have you.
Grand to be here.
Leah, your new book is called All the Little Hopes.
Yes.
You have fantastic titles. So everyone out there watching, if you have any questions, please enter them in the chat and I will get to as many of them as I can. But right now we are going to dive into a fascinating discussion. I want to get started by, instead of me telling everyone what your book is about, if you will each give us a little bit about your book, what we love and hate to call the elevator pitch. Kelly, you want to get us started?
Sure. And thanks to everyone who's here and to the host for inviting me. I'm just thrilled to be here. The Girls in the Stilt House is set in 1920s Mississippi, and most of it takes place on a secluded bald cypress swamp on the historic Natchez Trace, not far from where I lived. There is a swamp there. There's a fictional swamp in the book, but there is a swamp close to where I lived. It's Southern fiction with a bit of a Southern Gothic feel. I think of it as part Southern fiction, part historical fiction, part literary fiction. It's about two young women, they're still teenagers, whose lives become entangled by a murder that puts them both in danger. And there's a history that links these girls as well that only one of them knows about. Ada grew up in a stilt house with a difficult father. Something sets him off in the beginning, and Ada is saved by a stranger who appears out of nowhere in the night. That's Matilda from the other side of the trace and from across the racial divide. And under some dire circumstances, these two women set up housekeeping together and form a tenuous and complex partnership. They face a lot of struggles. There are some villains. There are some quiet heroes. It's about loss and perseverance in the Prohibition era South. But mostly I think of it as about hope and finding one's way through difficult circumstances. So a little longer than an elevator pitch, but there you go.
No, that was a good elevator. That was a good elevator ride. I'd love hearing all that. And now we know where the Stilt House title came from.
Yes.
So how about you, Leah?
Well, my book is a World War II book taking place in 1943, 44, and 45. And I've chosen as my narrators two young girls as well, much like Kelly. I have a young girl who comes from rather a charmed life, who becomes best friends with a girl who's really come from hard scrapple life. It's set in Eastern North Carolina, as I said, during the war. And it really is a wonderful murder mystery. And part of the aid of the girls comes Nancy Drew, who was a mentor and an inspiration in my youth that turned me on to reading so at such an early age. And so Nancy Drew is, of course, a big inspiration that not only helps the girls through the mysteries, but gets them into a lot of trouble, because none of the girls, of course, get to have the freedom or the respect that Nancy has. But it's a book, a World War II book that contains quite a bit of little known history that I was thrilled to weave in and out of this story as well. So it's a coming of age story, maybe a little bit of a different twist for World War II, told from the small town side and the price that they had to pay.
I love the parallels between your two books. We have the South, North Carolina, two girls who are very different yet must bond together.
Yes.
You are, and I know you are pals. So you are testament to Carl Jung's universal unconscious in so many ways.
Thank you.
And Jennifer, tell us a bit about Ariadne, because I'm a mythology geek myself. While other people were in cheerleading and cool clubs, I was in the Latin club in high school. So tell us a little bit about this book, please.
Oh, thank you. Well, I think the Latin Club is definitely the coolest place to be. Anyway. So Ariadne is it's a story that probably a lot of us are familiar with because we probably read it or had it told to us in childhood. The story of Theseus and the Minotaur, a really famous legend of a hero coming to slay the monster. But it's told from the perspective of the woman who actually made it all happen for Theseus. So the woman who saved the hero, and that's Ariadne. And like the other two books, it is actually told by two young female narrators as well, because in addition to Ariadne, I wanted to bring in the story of her younger sister Phaedra, who's quite a notorious woman in Greek mythology, and I really wanted to give her a chance to tell her side of the story. So you have two women who want to defy the patriarchal, misogynistic society in which they live and try to carve out their own destinies.
I just love it so much. I want to talk with all three of you about what I call origin stories. And in mythology, almost every culture in the world, probably every culture in the world, has an origin story about how the world came to be. And I love knowing the origin stories behind stories, because I feel like every story, if you go back and back and back, has all these little kernels or seeds or sparks that maybe you knew right away, or maybe only in hindsight you saw was the seed of the origin of your story. So Jennifer, you first. I have loved that story for all my myth-loving days. And I know sometimes in the copy they say this is about a forgotten woman in mythology, but I can tell you that I never forgot her. So tell me why the daughter of King Minos is, what spark, what little seed made you say, this is the story I want to tell? Can you even identify that?
Yeah, well, I think that the spark for it really came when I was at university, so it's quite a few years back, when I was introduced to Ovid for the first time, and I read Ovid's Heroides. So he's a Roman poet who took these women, these, you know, perhaps forgotten to some people women of mythology, and he gave them a voice. So it's a collection of letters written by these women, and Ariadne has a letter that she writes to Theseus, and it's a letter so full of passion and fury and defiance, and it's just a little snapshot into her life. And I think that's really where I got the idea that she had so much more of a story to tell, and so much of a story that perhaps hadn't been told. So that was probably kind of bubbling away in the background. And then when my children were born, and I would always read to them, I was reading them Greek mythology, and we read the story of Theseus and the Minotaur. And I think it was my eldest son said, "Oh, what happened to Ariadne after Theseus killed the Minotaur?" And I thought, well, this is a story that we definitely need to tell. So that's really how it came about.
Oh, I love that. See, it's so interesting to go back and see whether it was a son or a story you read. And I need to know the name of that book of letters. That's amazing. Say the name of that book again. What was that?
And so that's Ovid's Heroides.
Okay. I'm going to be tracking that down. So Leah, you say you are Southern by grace. And I love that. I was born in the Northeast and have been in the South since I was 12. So I don't get to say that I'm a Southerner born and raised. But I love that. North Carolina is your roots, and then on to Virginia. And I love the tagline on your website, or about this book, which is Books and Bees Converge. So can you tell us a bit about the spark for your book? Was it your hometown of North Carolina, or the war, or the bees, or a theme?
It's become a complex jumble, hasn't it, Patti? But
yes.
It began back in 2004 and 5 when I first had an interest in trying to write, and I was interviewing my mother about some of her amazing stories in Eastern North Carolina. She was one of 15 children raised on a tobacco farm with no running water and no electricity.
Oh, wow.
And I had said to her, I'd like to know more than what we hear sitting around the dinner table. So on one of the many, many afternoons when I was interviewing her, I had a tape recorder out, and then I would come home and transcribe it. My mother said that in 1944 that German POWs were helping at tobacco market. And that was one of just a handful of words out of many she had told me that day. And I had even wondered if it was true or if she'd gotten it mixed up, because I had never heard of Nazis actually being in my little hometown. So it was years later, looking for a second book, that I began doing serious research about German POWs and found out that in World War II that there were 700 camps across America, across 46 of our 48 states, and that there were 18 in my hometown state of North Carolina, and one was in the little town I was born in. So I went down with the idea, thinking that certainly a story about Nazis on American soil during World War II was going to have a very meaty bone that I could chew on and write a fabulous plot around. And the interesting thing is that the town of Williamston has wonderful historical archives about this, but there was an amazing, sweet, tender nature around their memories, because these boys that came over were not the hardened Nazis. Instead, they were artists and musicians and carpenters and teachers. And over the 2 years that they lived in that community, they became absorbed in some fascinating ways. So here I was faced with a story that I thought was going to have, again, a darker underbelly. And I was then left to create a story that did, because I really like a lot of tension on my pages when I'm writing. I like my characters truly challenged, and I love a lot of characters that have, again, a dark side. So I then went in search for a story in which I could encapsulate some amazing pieces of history, but that was truly a vein of fiction, with my girls and the man that went missing and another man that went missing and a third man that went missing. They were actually quite despicable, and probably some people were happy they had disappeared. But it began then with the weaving of these amazing pieces of history that were quite delicately lovely in this community. So I didn't want a saccharine sweet story, but in it had a whole lot of the good heart about these memories that I really did not want to taint.
I think it is so fascinating when we're doing our research, like you're talking about, Leah, and we go looking for one thing to substantiate the story we want to tell.
Yes.
And find a flip side of that story that shifts everything. It's one of my favorite things to find a nugget that changes the story you think you know.
Right,
So
right. Well, this little book being a World War II book, what my true blessing was coming across a number of small or little known components. For example, I was able to meet with 6 people who remembered German POWs on their family farms. But then they told me that one lady said that her father had 100 beehives, and that her dad had signed a government contract for the beeswax. And so all of a sudden I'm on this marvelous thread about the value of beeswax during World War II, that were waterproofing all the tents and used for ammunition to keep all the rusting away. And it was, and then also she threw out on the table in the discussion something called purple honey. And so I had these wonderful nuggets that I truly had not expected, that I then created and made a very big component in the book. And as you say, we start with literally just crumbs or threads of a story. Yeah. And even after just 2 books, I think I have learned that you can relax knowing that the story sort of fills on its own.
And we find something and you're like, well, of course, that was always in there, even though I just found it. Exactly.
It's so natural.
So Kelly, this book has been called a remarkable debut with a shocking twist of fate. And you grew up in Natchez, Mississippi, as we mentioned at the beginning, at the southern end of the Natchez Trail, which just sounds romantic. And like you were meant to be a writer, and you grew from the ground of Natchez, Mississippi. But I have heard something about an old broken tomb with a cracked lid. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the sparks of the origin story for your novel?
Absolutely, yes. And thank you for that. I come from a little different mindset than Leah, I think. There's so many different elements of living in the South, in the deep South. I left the South, not the South. I left Mississippi at 19, but it's where I came of age. It's the place that I know from that kind of from their place. It's the place where you figure out the world, where you grew up. Yes. And I grew up during some really tumultuous years of the civil rights movement. really just some of the early, just some tumultuous years. And as a kid, I spent a lot of time at the library trying to figure out what the heck was going on around me. And that was my experience of the South. I found books like Anne Moody's Coming of Age in Mississippi, which is an amazing book before my time, but an amazing book about what the experience of Mississippi was like then. I checked out an old out-of-print copy of Solomon Northup's 12 Years a Slave, and that led me to a lot of slave narratives and early civil rights literature, again, way before my time, and I was just a little kid. But I started to understand what was going on, and that really so informed my mindset and kind of set my step in life. As for the tomb, my sister is old enough to be my mother. The generations in my family are very stretched out. Women have children right until the last minute in my family, or wait until the last minute. So when my family told stories, when my grandmother told stories that I loved to hear when I was a kid, she was talking about a very long time ago. One of my sets of grandparents, who were, of course, long gone by the time I was born because of these stretched out generations, but they were actually sharecroppers before I was born. So I heard stories about that. I feel very at home in the 20s. My sister used to take me on treks through down the Natchez Trace. We have a family cemetery out on the Trace. And she was interested in family history, so she would rub chalk on these old tombstones to kind of bring the inscriptions back to life, where she could take a picture of them. And I saw an old above ground broken tomb with a crack across the lid as a kid. Kind of carried that around in my head forever. And when this story started to gel in my head, I thought, what a perfect place for two teenagers who don't have a lot of resources to hide a body if they needed to. That was kind of the origin of that. From there, the story kind of took off, and I just wanted to write the kind of book that I like to read. I'm a sentence first writer and reader, so it's all about language for me. I always say I could write a whole book about daffodils blowing in the breeze and just be really happy. But I tried to do the things that I like to read: lush language, landscape that is kind of a character in itself, complex characters that aren't exactly what you would expect, and sort of internally driven. And then also, I had to throw in a lot of action that is not really my nature to do. So this shocking twist of fate that Publishers Weekly talked about took a lot of effort from me.
Well, they say the things that are the smoothest to read take the hardest work. I think all three of us can bear out with that. So all three of you have told this story from a feminine perspective. And plural, you know, we have sisters, we have best friends. And since this is the WNBA panel, I think it's interesting to talk about this and why you chose the point of views that you chose. Jennifer, I know you addressed it a bit, but I want you to talk to us about what it means to you and to your work, because your next book is also told from a Greek goddess point of view, and what it means for you, for your family, for your work. I know you teach, what it means for your teaching. So can you talk a little bit about that choice to us?
Yeah, of course. So I think, as I mentioned, I think most of us become familiar with Greek mythology when we are children, and those stories, I think, are so often told, and well, there is a resurgence now of telling them from the female perspective, but before then, they were really told about the men in the stories from their point of view. And something that really strikes me in a lot of the Greek myths is really how empty the heroic narrative is. You know, when it's a man on a quest for glory, on a quest for fame, and how many people pay the price for his immortality through fame along the way, kind of how everybody else is expendable. And the stories that we hear in childhood are so important in shaping the way that we see the world. So I think it's such an empowering and such an important thing to do, to take these stories, which are brilliant stories, amazing characters, things that have captivated us all for centuries, and to look at them from a different angle, to kind of twist them and turn them on their head, and take these women who, as I said in the case of Ariadne's sister Phaedra, have perhaps even been reviled through history for behaviour that is nothing compared to what the heroes of Greek mythology and the gods of Greek mythology do all of the time. So it meant a lot to me to take this female perspective, especially when you consider how fundamental Ariadne is in Theseus's story, and how little of the credit she gets, and how much of the work that she does. And when it comes to my second novel, Electra, where I've taken the perspective of Clytemnestra and her daughter, these are women who have had more of the spotlight on them. They are more famous women, but they're famous women because they are bad women, because they have transgressed, because they have taken control of their destiny. So again, I thought that giving them their chance to tell the story, kind of inhabiting their voice and their mindset and what led them to do what they did feel like a really important and significant thing to do. And when you asked about teaching, I was teaching secondary school, so high school, and I think that we need to make sure that young women and girls see themselves reflected in literature, that, you know, we really make sure that we are showing them that women can do all kinds of things, and that women can be the hero of the story as well.
And not just the hero because they transgressed, not just the hero. I think of Persephone, right? And how she picked the flower and then just, you know, but the story centers on her mother searching for her as if she did something wrong. So these myths, and any stories really, they become ingrained in young girls, and then they take on that view, or that kind of archetype of being female. And I love how all three of you are flipping it on its head. So bravo. So Leah,
Yes.
Lucy fancies herself a Nancy Drew, which I love, because somewhere on these shelves I have a couple vintage Nancy Drews.
Yes.
And Bert, her friend, actually believes Nancy Drew is a family member, which is so funny. So what is Nancy Drew for? You address the mystery of the missing men book, and you even have a character who binds her breasts, addressing the feminine and what it means to be feminine. And there's this whole cataclysmic coming of age. So was a lot of this on purpose? Talk to us about your reason for telling it from that feminine perspective.
Well, the two girls that are 13, interestingly, Nancy Drew was 13 that year as well. She was born in 1930, meaning the first book came out. I just remembered, of course, in the case of Nancy Drew, when I was 10 or 11, just literally inhaling her books. And it was the magic that a world like that could exist, that would have liberties, freedoms, respect. I chose at the beginning to have the two girls with their very different backgrounds. The young girl coming from the mountains in Western North Carolina, binding her breasts, she was trying to avoid stepping over into womanhood and into adulthood, because in her view, the world was quite dismal. She had seen her mother worn down to a nub, and it was a very, very hard life. So, and then too, I can remember what a tomboy I was at that age. I mean, it was, I don't remember dreading becoming a woman or moving into adulthood, but it certainly was, again, blue jeans and bare feet and playing marbles and reading comic books, not playing with baby dolls. But here come, in the book, I think there's a couple of really amazing parts of femininity. Not only the two girls who begin at age 13, 14, and 15, developing over those years, but you have on the other far end two very, very old, wise women. One is funny, one is extraordinarily mysterious. Trula Freed is a mystery that absolutely befuddles my character, my charmed character, Lucy. But there's an adorable character named Aunt Fanny Bell, who was a real Aunt Fanny Bell to my mother growing up, who was the richest lady in town, a short lady who played honky-tonk piano and was really very childlike herself. But what comes out of their mouths in the case of the older women is amazing wisdom and stories at really pivotal moments in the girls' lives that I think influence them in the best of ways. But then there is a fifth female in the group, and that is Mrs. Brown, Lucy's mother. And Minnie Brown is really a grounding force right in the middle, who is the amazing solid wisdom of understanding that helps Bert, of course, to come out of her traumatic past, and of course is helping to guide her children toward adulthood. All of these women are, I think that I knew that in my own past I had similar women that were so very, very important to me. I'm sometimes asked, Patti, am I as smart as my character, or how do I write smart characters? And of course, I have to give them the credit. I'm truly not as smart or as patient or as insightful as they can come out with. But it's wonderful to read those on the pages and to remember what it is to help guide young minds like my two girls.
Oh, I love it. I love the honoring, right? The honoring of the past, the honoring of the women, the honoring of different generations, even completely imagined characters as we honor them.
Yes.
So Kelly, you chose to tell this story from Ada and Matilda's point of view, each on different sides of, I think how you describe it, the poverty line. So why these two feminine perspectives? And I'm curious, because they are very different, who was easier or harder to write? And I know there is a moment where Matilda cries out, not afraid, not broken, angry. And I know this is so opposite from what Ada might holler out. So I want you to talk about writing from those two completely different female perspectives.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, they were both poor. They were from different sides of the racial divide. Well, I think with Ada, I wanted to, as you were talking about honoring women, everybody loves the fierce hero who overcomes circumstances that are dire and, the feisty character. But I think sometimes in literature, especially current literature, rather than, the old 20s and 30s literature that I grew up reading, the old classic Southern Gothic writers, I think that sometimes overlooked are some of the people who are young people who are just completely broken and stripped by their circumstances. And sometimes for people like that, what looks to us like the smallest of steps are really just enormous strides. And I think sometimes we overlook that because they don't seem to have, just been utterly triumphal when really they have been. So that was my goal with Ada, to pay tribute to those people who make the smallest strides in the hardest of circumstances. Matilda, I don't know. I would say she was probably more difficult to write. I spent a lifetime reading African-American literature from the time I was very young. I knew my place. I knew Mississippi. I knew this culture. I knew the landscape. I knew the political and social culture. And yet I was very hesitant to write Matilda. I actually wrote her from a very great distance in the first iteration of this book. She only spoke in the last chapter. I did not want to cause any harm. After growing up where I did and being witness to so much that affected me, had such an impact on me, my main goal was not to cause any harm. My agent read the first version. He loved Matilda. He said the pages light up when she's on the page. please ditch this other storyline that you have going on, this secondary storyline, and bring Matilda forward.
Wow.
It took an entire year deciding whether to do that. I left this wonderful New York agent on hold for a year. And so I will say that Matilda was the character that I spent the most time thinking about and the most attention to. There's a tradition in Southern Gothic literature of the old classic Southern Gothic literature of taking societal norms and kind of flipping them. So I did that with two women, Ada and Matilda. I kind of flipped the power. In the 1920s, neither of these women had any power really, but Matilda particularly, with what was going on racially in Mississippi with the racial issues there, Matilda was in a particularly difficult circumstance. And so I kind of did a societal flip. She was the one who knew how to get things done that would get her where she needed to be. She refused to do anything that was not her choice in her dealing with Ada. And the same with Gertie, who is my favorite character, an elderly midwife, who the book doesn't mention this, but she would have been born into slavery before the Civil War, being elderly in the 20s. And it was important to me to show Gertie making her own choices, not being forced into a role that society would have placed her in, typically at that time, but finding a way to make her own choices about what she would do and who she would do what for. All of these issues about females in a time like that, coming from totally different societal arenas, was difficult, but what I set out to try to do, and to try to do it authentically and well. So there you go.
Oh, it's fascinating. And I think it's good for readers to know that we don't just write the books and then boom, they're magic. They appear, sometimes somebody says this would be better if, and we have to decide whether we want to take the time or the energy to make it better and not just settle. And Kelly, I'm glad that you took the time to bring Matilda into the scene.
Thank you. Thank you.
Time is flying by. I can't believe it. We have less than 8 minutes, but I don't want to go before we talk about research. And I know we touched on it, and there's a great question from the audience that I want to include in my research question, which is, was there anything that you were reluctant to include in your books? And I know I write historical fiction, and there have been times I found out something about somebody I was writing about, and I want the reader to love them. So I don't necessarily want them to know, but it's the truth. And the truth is complicated in the South, in mythology, everywhere. So Jennifer, I want to start with you about research. Number one, did you veer at all from primary source of this myth? And is there anything you were reluctant to include?
Yes, to both. So I used a lot of ancient sources. So I used, like I mentioned, Ovid, the Heroides. I used ancient Greek drama. So there's a tragedy that features Phaedra, Ariadne's sister, called Hippolytus, because obviously it takes the name of the man that she's involved with. So I used all the ancient sources that I could find, but sometimes it was specifically to deviate from them. So that's why I mentioned Hippolytus. In that play, and this is what I was really reluctant to include, a little bit like Kelly was saying, Phaedra, my second narrator, she wasn't really in the first draft of the book, and it was the same thing that when I went to my agent, she said, this character is, so important and is really making the book better, so bring her in more, which I was really, when I started to write in Phaedra's voice, I really found her such an interesting character. But one of the things that she's famous for in the tragedy is that she makes a false allegation, and that to me was something that this character wouldn't do, and it wasn't something that I wanted to perpetuate the myth of, that she would do that. So that was an instance where I took that research and went in a different direction because I wanted to tell a different story. And to me, that just wasn't true to who that character really was.
I love that, because sometimes we find a nugget of truth and it helps the story. And sometimes we find a nugget of truth and we're like, oh man, I don't want to use that. So I love hearing that you and Kelly had similar. How about you, Leah? I know,
I'm in the same boat, especially the parallel with Kelly. One of the things that we writers now face in the editorial process is something called a sensitivity editor that is going through. And that's probably been only in the last 3, 4, 5 years. And so there came a time late in the work on my manuscript when it went to the sensitivity editor. And mine is set in the South, and I was born in 1947 in this community that I write about. So in the 50s, I was very aware of the Black-white world and the various economic status of them, and the thing, as a result of that, I was very cautious to not step on toes or to go where I truly did not know or walk in those shoes. I think American Dirt has had all of us become squeamish about certain things. So my sensitivity editor, when she came in almost at my 0 hour, I think I had 3 days to address this. She said, the Blacks are almost non-existent in your book. And of course, I said to myself, well, that came from being frightened of stepping on toes. So what I chose to do was to represent my family, which is the Brown family, as being sort of a neutral territory. And I actually remember meeting neutral territories in the South where both Blacks and whites were welcomed. And in this case, it was to the weekly storytelling time that was sort of open to the public, and also to the welcoming home time for a Black man who returned from the war, and everyone united as a welcome home party for him. So it was probably not the real South, but I chose not to go there. My story was a different story than that. As I had mentioned earlier in my research, I simply found out that the part about the German POWs was much too tender in this particular community. So I chose not to, in fact, originally I was going to try to connect it to the KKK, to having some Nazi threats that were going to be part of the community. And I chose not to dirty that by fiction. This would have been a fiction addition to it. So that's what you do, is you say, where are the big lessons and how can I make them better, or to have my characters both feel authentic, but not to have to veer off track for that.
Yep, that's the complicated part of research. You find something and you say, does this go in the book? Because not everything can go in. And so we have to choose the cornerstone or the touchstone and then decide whether it needs to go in. One
of the things that my husband and I did was to spend a full day in the old newspaper stacks going through 1943, 44, 45, and there were 2 publications per week during that time. So we had 100 a year that we were going through. And I found late in the story was an amazing circus that came to town on the train. But by that time, we were very much looking for things that were having the plot line begin to fly at the speed of lightning. So we didn't want to step off of that track. And so that story didn't get put in there. I was super excited when we found it and investigated more about it. A tent that held 1,500 people. So that had to be put aside. Again, you're having to pick and choose what really is serving the story best.
So Kelly, I know the landscape. I don't think I could have resisted the circus, sorry. But Kelly, I know that the landscape had so much to do with your research. You mentioned you wanted to use the landscape, both physical and cultural, of 1920s Mississippi to convey something universal. Can you talk a little bit about that research, and if there's anything you found that you were reluctant to include as we round out our time?
Okay, and I will be brief, but
you don't have to be brief.
Yes, I did want to. Landscape is everything to me. It's where I start with each book. I pick the landscape first. And I did want to convey, as I wrote in my author's note, the contrast between the beauty of the landscape and the brutality of what was going on in that place at that time. Unlike Leah, I went there. I did go there. But the truth of it is, as I was doing research and also based on what I knew to be true of that, for the period that I grew up and the period in which my mother and my grandmother grew up, it may seem that I really heavily went there, but the truth of the matter is, in the place where I grew up, if I had told everything, if I had been completely authentic about what it was like at that time, it would have been way too much. It would have completely distracted from the story. Mm-hmm. And while some people might think I went too far, I really just scratched the surface. That's the truth, you know, and so that was a dilemma for me. That was a struggle for me, how much to tell, how much to not overwhelm the reader with, because my goal was not to present a history book, but to tell the simple story of these two women. I didn't want them to be overshadowed. And yet, as Leah talked about with her sensitivity reader, just leaving the Black characters kind of in the background and in the margins. Where I grew up, at that time, the demographics were about half Black and half white. I believe it's much more predominantly Black now. So to leave those characters in the background came to not feel right either. Yeah. So all of that was a dilemma, but the research was brutal. You know, I had to take what I knew and base that, you know, against the research that I was doing. It was tough. And I left out a whole lot because I had to. It was more for me, what do I leave out than what do I include to tell a good story?
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating. The research for all these historical novels is so enriching that sometimes we want to let everybody know what we have learned. And yet, if it doesn't serve the story,
yes,
it has to go. But guess what, ladies? We can put that in the for another book file. So this went way, way too fast. I have loads more questions and things to talk about with y'all, but we're just going to have to do this again. So Southern Festival of Books, we thank you for having us. And the WNBA and Rayanne from Parnassus, y'all, thank you for having us. Y'all have an amazing day.
Thank you.
Thank you.